Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to be a moderator for today's Women's Entrepreneurship Symposium. I'm joined by two outstanding and knowledgeable women, Aji Fatou Jain and Tanae Dolphin. They have a lot of valuable information and experiences to share with us today. But before we begin, let me provide a broad outline of what I hope to cover. We have a dynamic session, so let's see how it goes. But I think what we should start with here is a discussion of setting the stage. And to do that by describing some of the facts about the current landscape of women in business and inventors, women as inventors on US patents. So the question is, what do we know and what are the key objectives and areas of focus? Next, it'd be nice to hear about what the challenges and actually more importantly, what are the opportunities for women to become successful entrepreneurs? What is working and what is not working to increase participation and success? And the third area I hope to get to today is to talk about the paths forward and the resources that are available to women to become entrepreneurs and even to invent something patentable. And each of these, both invention and entrepreneurship, are certainly team sports. And what that means is that it's important to engage and work with others in order to be successful and maximize your chances of success. So without further ado, let me go ahead and allow each of our distinguished guests this afternoon to introduce themselves. And let me begin with Tanae. Tanae?
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Andy, and thank you for inviting me here. My name is Tanae Dolphin, and I am the Executive Director for the National Women's Business Council. NWBC is a federal advisory committee that was established under HR 5050, the Women's Business Ownership Act, in 1988. It was in 1988 when women first got the opportunity to sign for their own loans. We are responsible for providing independent advice to the President, the Congress, and the SBA administrator. And often we do that by convening women leaders, business leaders, industry leaders, and other folks in the community to bring their voices to bear here in Washington, D.C. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm excited to hear what Aji has to say because she's so knowledgeable. And I'm also just excited to share the information that we have. Thank you, Andy.
Awesome. Thank you, Tanae. Aji?
Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks, Andy, for inviting me today. As you have indicated earlier, this is going to be a great discussion about women-owned businesses, opportunities, challenges, and what lies ahead. So I'm an economist with the Center for Economic Studies, and my primary research interests center on creating housing and income security for low and moderate income households, business owner demographics, and consumer and housing finance. I have a passion for connecting data with economic tools to answer pressing economic questions, such as the ones we'll be discussing here today. To get us started, I'd like to begin by laying out the landscape of women-owned businesses. So the slides are up. We can begin showing those. Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to say that the comments made in this presentation are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Census Bureau. Okay, so up to the nice, layout of these numbers. As we can see, I have on the left-hand side the employer businesses and the non-employer businesses, and these are going to be the most recent stats that we have out of the US Census Bureau. Over 90% of women-owned businesses are non-employers. And when I say non-employers, you could be thinking about a massage therapist, a contractor, or a consultant working for themselves. With 20.9% of the share in employer businesses, we have a total of 5.7 million businesses, or we had in 2019. Women only make up about 5% of total sales and revenues, or you can call it receipts among these firms, compared to 41% of the non-employer firms. And they make up, or actually they make up 41% of the non-employer firms and about 23% of the revenues. The differences among employer and non-employer businesses are starker when we look at these by race and ethnicity, and that leads me to the next slide. On the left-hand side, I have the 2019 employer businesses, and on the right-hand side, I have a combined 2018 employer and non-employer. And we can see here that non-Hispanic, white, so all of these race groups except for Hispanics are non-Hispanics, right? So for non-Hispanic whites and Asians, we see that they are more likely to be employer, women-owned businesses, with 75.4% and 13.8% employer businesses, respectively. And we can see for the non-employer, 64.6, or non-employer plus employer combined, 64.6% and 7.9% respectively. And this is non-white Hispanics and Asians. And when we look at Hispanics and Black or African Americans, we see that they're more likely to be non-employers. And so we have a share of 14.5% and 12.7% respectively versus 7.4% and 3.6% respectively. And we can, see that. So when we're talking about women-owned businesses, when you look at these differences, sort of questions begin to raise, or begin to come up in your mind as to where do we need most work, and how do we move forward with supporting these businesses. Now, the next information that I would like to share would be which industries make up the most in women-owned businesses, and that leads me to the next slide. And I'll highlight a few here. That healthcare and social assistance, so you're talking about your home healthcare, your daycares, are where most women-owned businesses are concentrated, so 14.5% to be exact. Professional, scientific, and technical services, so lawyers and accountants, make up about 14.3%, while only about 3% are in the accommodation and food services industry, so hotels and caterers. Okay? In the next slide, I highlight the growth of these employer businesses because, when you're looking at employer businesses, the landscape looked pretty different than what non-employers, or you can say self-employed, look like. So compared to men, women-owned businesses grew about 17% versus 5%, while receipts grew 52% between 2012 and 2019. So we can see that the businesses, the women-owned businesses, have a lot of potential as far as growth. And we can see that also in the number of people that they employ. So their workers grew 28% during this time period versus 11% for men. And the total population, just to put this into perspective, the total population for women and men, for women grew 4% versus 5%. This is total population. Right? And so what I do in the next slide is just looking at non-employer firms and what their growth looks like. And it seems like for the 4 years that we have data for, we can see that although women-owned businesses grew less than their men counterparts at 4.2% versus 5.1%, their receipts surged 20.1% compared to 14.4%. So when we look at non-employers, we see that women tend to do really, we'll say, a lot better here than men as far as revenue is concerned. So that leads me to my question as to what if women-owned employer businesses reach parity with men-owned employer businesses? So next slide. If women's owned businesses accounted for 51.6%, this is the share of the adult women population, we would see that there would be about 900,000 more women-owned businesses versus what we have. So 2.9 million businesses versus 2 million businesses. As far as receipts, also, they could be surpassing their potential as to what we're doing actually today. So $7.7 trillion in revenue versus $3.1 trillion in revenue. And women in this case would be employing about 14.4 million more employees than currently. So parity would look really great for the US economy, as we can see in these numbers that I'm presenting on this chart. So I would like to wrap it up there, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Aji. That were great slides. I have a few comments, but before I say anything, I think I'll just pass it over to Tanae and see if she wants to add some facts and some information on the landscape out there, or at least some experiences.
Yeah, probably a little bit more on the experience side. I mean, again, Aji did an amazing job laying that out. And I think it's so important for folks to see the numbers. I think some context behind that number and why there's such a difference. And I'll even go into some of the demographic piece is that, there still remains an issue in equitable financing. Women still report, and one of the reasons why I shared at the top of my introduction about co-signing a loan is that women still find it difficult to get streams of financing, whether it be lines of credit, VC, CDFI, et cetera. And even more so for BIPOC women. I think that there have been a number of stories and experiences, and really the data shows that all things being equal, BIPOC women are still being denied financing. And so it's really, really hard to start a business, let alone grow a business without some of that support. And then we all know the biggest elephant in the room is the domestic and childcare responsibilities that continue to be connected in balance to women, which is, I love my son and I want to support him all that I can, but there are consequences or connections to that. And so how we show up in the workplace and definitely how we show up in our business is impacted. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about how the pandemic impacted that. But those numbers really do reflect the issues. And I think the last thing I'll say is really diversification. We always see that, we always talk about it, but if we want Main Street to be diversified, and I know, Andy, you're going to talk a little bit about patents, and we want patents to be diversified, we've got to also diversify the folks that are making the decisions, the folks in the network. How do we get more women connected to these opportunities? How do we get more women connected to being a part of the pipeline? And then how do we get more women connected to the financing decisions? On the other side of underwriting, more women VCs, more women grant makers, et cetera. And so just a little context for the numbers that Aji showed, but we'll get into a little bit more as we go along. Thanks, Andy.
Yes, for sure, we will. And those are great contextual points. Actually, you brought up a lot of things that I think we want to talk about additionally, right? So a little bit more, as you just said, because they're so important. I want to kind of, when I saw the slides, I thought, okay, this is really excellent because it really highlights a few critical points. First is, it's really indisputable that there's underrepresentation of women in business. I think that's a fact that's well borne out by the data. It's also interesting and I think important to note that there are opportunities here. In other words, women-owned businesses are not, they can be highly successful businesses, and many of them are highly successful businesses. So any kind of impression that they're not should be dispelled immediately. And I do love that about your slides as well, Aji. And I think the third thing that really jumped out at me when you presented that is the fact that we need a pipeline of people to feed into these businesses. We have to prepare our young girls and our young women to be successful, and all of our populace, but we're focusing here on women. But so that was another theme that really jumped out. And I don't want anybody to get the wrong impression here, right? So when we have more women-owned businesses, that doesn't mean less for anybody. This is not what they call a zero-sum game. This is an expansion of the overall system to include more women and to create better and higher and more prosperous standards of living for all of us. And so that's important to keep in mind as well. This is not a zero-sum game. So thank you for pointing those things out. So I think what I would like to do is just take a minute or two, if I may. I don't want to send us too far afield, but patents are actually intimately related with entrepreneurship. They have a number of roles that they can play in terms of helping entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs. And actually the financing side, as you mentioned today, is one of those areas where patents have been known to be quite helpful in terms of securing financing. So if we think about women's participation in the patent system, the question is, how do we know how many women are actually participating in the patent system? What are the metrics that we should use to really understand what's happening in the landscape and in the environment? And on the business side, Aji has provided some awesome statistics there. So I really want to highlight two statistics two metrics that we care a lot about in the Office of the Chief Economist here at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. One of those is the share of patents with at least one woman inventor. Now, that particular metric counts the documents that women are on, that is the patent documents. So that's not really counting people. And the problem with counting documents is that one person may be very prolific. So they produce 10 documents, but that's still only one person. So we need to do more. And the second metric that I think I'd like to emphasize is actually the percentage of women inventors that are participating on patents applications and grants from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Here, we are now counting people, and this gives us a much better perspective on the participation of women. So when we count documents, we get about 22% of the patent documents have at least one woman inventor on them, which is quite a few documents. But when we look at the actual people, when we look at the actual women, we find it's only about 13% of women are participating as inventors on patents. And if you compare that, I don't have the numbers and I didn't prepare slides for today, but I think many of us on this webinar and in the symposium recognize that that's a terribly small percentage, particularly compared to STEM degrees for women. So there is a significant and substantial kind of pipeline problem. Now, both of these metrics are increasing happily. They're both increasing. The problem is they're increasing at a terribly slow rate. In other words, the line is flat, it's not going up, and we need that line to go up. We need the increase at a faster rate. And so I just will kind of bring this kind of patent thing to a close by saying that it highlights two critical parts about women's participation. One is the entry of women into patenting. And this, of course, would also help for the entry of women into business. So we care a lot about what can we do to facilitate women's entry into patenting and women's entry into business. The second thing that I think we need to think about a lot about is how do we keep the women involved? How do we decrease the exit rate of women from patenting and from business, and perhaps as an employee or as a business owner? And we know that there are important policies that are being discussed to help women in the circumstances that are somewhat different sometimes than men, and particularly childcare. Some of those issues have been emphasized. So I think that each of these kind of entry and exit factors are going to be really important. All right, so we've established some really critical facts in the landscape here. We've established some key objectives and some areas that we need to focus on. So let's talk about some opportunities. And today I would like to go back to you because your involvement with the National Women's Business Council is definitely giving you a lot of kind of grassroots and on the ground experience, boots on the ground, if you will, experience. And so I just would like to ask for each of you, but I'll start with you today. What are some of the opportunities that exist for women to start their own businesses?
Yeah, thanks again, Andy. I'll start sort of where you left off, and really sort of stay in the world of STEM and patenting. So for a long time now, we've been focused on STEM opportunities because we understand the potential. One of the things that we're looking to do is also look at other industries that are high growth, high yield, but still underrepresented. And so the council is really going to take some time this year and next year to focus on those industries, be it construction, be it supply chain, all of those things where you don't see a high concentration of women, but again, there's high growth. When we think about STEM, though, there's still some other issues that we need to, in terms of, how do we increase that rate of growth? And one of the things that we hear at our roundtables is that the cost, even the cost of patenting, right, is still kind of prohibited. I mean, I don't think folks are ready for the cost sometimes. And so really, how do we begin to educate early on, introduce folks early on what that looks like, and then provide some kind of funding? If funding is a problem at the onset, right, then by the time you're even still getting to patenting, right, there's no support or financial assistance for that. So how do we as a government holistically think about those things? The other thing is really working to have more synergies and overlap and the SBIR, STTR opportunities. And so we're looking at that. But let's go now really to some opportunities. I think one of the things that COVID did is shock folks into entrepreneurship, right? There were some people who left their jobs, sometimes out of necessity, because there was no other way to sort of go in and do the 9 to 5. And for some, COVID also strengthened it. But one of the things that people did was go to e-commerce. So there's a number of businesses that opened up via e-commerce. And what we've been looking at is the entire ecosystem that is supporting that e-commerce world, right? So it's fintech, it's cybersecurity, it's web design, it's graphic design, and all of those things. And so we understand that there are opportunities there. So again, still kind of connected to STEM, but really focused on supporting the e-commerce world. I don't think we're going in another direction. While there will be experiences in retail operations that will be rich, e-commerce is definitely here to stay. And I think the last thing I'll raise up is still really looking at the intersection of healthcare and science. Again, still connected to STEM. But what we've also seen is the health disparities, and there really is an opportunity to disrupt healthcare. And I think women are the folks to do it. They've already been doing it. And I would even raise up Dr. Corbett, Kazmika Corbett, who, her research led to the vaccine for COVID. But there's just so much work to be done. We saw the health inequities, and women usually tend to sort of look at areas that are really specific to them, and no one else is listening. Let me go in and find a solution for it. So we're really focused on that, and I think there are a great number of opportunities there.
Yeah, that's great. Aji, when I
Great.
know that the data aren't out yet, but go ahead and you have some things you'd like to add on this.
Yes, I actually just want to piggyback on what Tanae said about the focusing on the industries that are high productive or high production industries, or I'll say those that are highest in receipts and revenues. And if we look at the share among in those areas and the share of women in those areas, we see that there could be a lot of work to be done there. So construction, transportation and warehousing, real estate, these are some of those top earning or I'll say top revenue yielding industries. So those would be opportunities for women to go into. I'll say in terms of challenges, I think Tanae talked a lot about access to finance, access to capital, business expansion. We have also women-owned businesses, which a lot of them sort of the reasons owning a business for a woman is very different when we're thinking about it as opposed to men. And so I'm not surprised that a lot of women-owned businesses are going into or are working for themselves and doing, the non-employer side of it, although we see more revenues generated in the employer side. So if we could, sort of do more work there to encourage women to go into the areas where they could potentially become employer-owned businesses and also, expand there. I know that as far as childcare is concerned, that is the biggest that's one of, besides access to capital, that could be a deterrent to why women would not want to expand and sort of become employer businesses, because they have to care for their loved ones. And we saw that during the pandemic, for example, a lot of women went into childcare and caring for loved ones, not just children. And so those are sort of hindrances that exist for women. So
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It might, I don't know if this is true by data, but it makes sense sort of logically that non-employer businesses will allow a more flexible day, and that may be something that's desirable, right? So maybe employer businesses need to get these additional flexibilities, put them in place that will allow women to be able to be in both of the employer and non-employer businesses, right? Um, that makes a lot of sense. Um, okay, wonderful. So when we talk about patenting, I'll just turn back to that for a minute. That's the area that, that I know. I actually, when I started at the USPTO, I guess it's been 7 years now. I didn't really know that much about the costs of patenting. Now, the costs of patenting are a big issue, but it turns out that when you look at the costs, there's really there's two components to it, right? One is the cost of legal representation, and the other is the cost of the fees of the PTO. And between those two, the fees are actually relatively small relative to the legal fees. And so there needs to be some thought about the kind of the proportion of legal fees that might be required to actually get the patent in hand. But one thing that we've noticed from the data is that more women are coming through our small and micro entity status than are coming as a percentage than are coming through the undiscounted or large entity status. So that really suggests that women are active in entrepreneurship and are approaching the patent office from the small and micro entity perspective and are qualifying there. So that I think your point today on costs is a really important one, and that we have to kind of build out. We have to build out more knowledge on that. In terms of like opportunities in patenting, patent office, we've been looking at, actually, I found out that the earliest study of women in patenting was in the 1990s by the USPTO. I had no idea about it until we started looking at it in the office in 2017. And then 2018, the Success Act was passed and asked the office to look at the participation of women, minorities, and veterans as patent applicants and as patent recipients. And that really kind of started the process of us really looking at these issues in a much deeper way and thinking about opportunities. And so I want to mention, while I've got the mic for a second, and please chime in if you want to add some more on opportunities, but I would like to mention very quickly following the Success Act report that we submitted in October of 2019. One of the key things that we promised to do was to start a council, and we have a Council for Inclusive Innovation, which is headed and chaired by the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, and it's an incredible group of leaders from industry, government, private sector, and nonprofit organizations, and one of the key objectives for this council, and it's been something that we've been working on, is to create a strategy that's going to help women to become realize both invention and entrepreneurship. We want to help women and minorities and veterans to become innovators, starting with the very earliest times and heading on through. And so I guess a question I have is, in your experiences, when you think about your educational opportunities, and this is going back a little bit, Tanae, to the STEM, right? Are there particular approaches or particular angles that you think are going to be more effective for helping women, young women, to get an invention education, to think about invention in that kind of mindset, and to prepare themselves to patent and become entrepreneurs?
Yeah,
Um,
I think there's been a big shift, and you can see it in the educational system. You can see it even in our television. I have a 7-year-old, so I get to see cartoons. And you can see it even in some of the toy offerings that are given to kids, and really the emphasis for young girls. But again, I think we have to continue that and grow that, and while we started in elementary, there's got to be a very heavy emphasis in middle school and high school. Um, and it's got to be done in a way that is relevant and meaningful to them. And that may need to be a culturally competent model and not just here's science, here's math. So I know that there are a number of organizations that are studying this. Get Cities is one of them that is really focused on both education, workforce, and entrepreneurship, and getting women really connected to STEM. Um, we're still exploring it, but we haven't really talked as much about the younger pieces as we have what are the barriers to women who are ready and right now. But I'm so glad that you're looking at the STEM and we're talking about the pipeline, because if we don't talk about the pipeline, then there's nobody to remove the barriers for.
yes, thank you. Anji, I know you're an economist. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I just wanted to add the importance of role models there because, it's very important very early on to see, to be able to connect with people who are doing, work that you'd be interested in. So, for example, if you have a local business owner that's a neighbor that is, interested in doing work that is connected or uh, that is doing work in data science, for example, or something related to the STEM field, then you'll probably be more likely to sort of take advantage of those spillovers, right? Those positive externalities. And so I just think that it's very important that businesses who are involved in these areas, women-owned businesses, tap into their network, expand their network. I think it would be good. I think that there's a lot of opportunity when social networks are, connected or explored or, interactive. Because I became an economist because I had a professor who looked like me and was an economist, right? And I saw her as a successful economist that was able to take data and do research and come up with, answers to questions that are going to be bettering my community. So I think that having those connections are really, really important. And the more that we do that, and I think that council is really, really important. And I applaud that the work that they're doing, and hope that they expand it not only for women-owned, businesses and try and increase patents, but across the board with other things, because we do know that there's value when when we win, when women win, when people of color win, there's value. So hopefully we can explore further.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the story. I'm glad that you were able to get an inspiration to become an economist. That traditionally, the economics profession has had its own problems with diversity. And one of our Edison scholars, Lisa Cook, who is a professor at Michigan State University, has spoken and written quite a bit, excuse me, about, pardon me, about the fact that we need to diversify the economics profession. So I'm really, really happy that you were able to find that person and you were inspired, right, to become an economist.
I just want to echo. I mean, there's nothing like representation, and that is exactly what Aji is talking about. And when you can see yourself in a myriad of things, then the world of possibilities opens up. So we've got to be intentional
Right.
about that. Thank you for sharing that, Aji.
Thank you. Absolutely. So, Tanae, you mentioned a few minutes ago, I'd like to pick up on that again. You mentioned that, we are, and women are facing particular challenges in COVID. Now, of course, all of us have faced challenges, and I hope that we're coming to the end of this roller coaster, but I don't know. Nobody seems to know for sure. But just happened to just kind of fortuitously, really, yesterday, the Department of Labor released a report. It's called "Bearing the Cost: How Overrepresentation in Undervalued Jobs Disadvantaged Women During the Pandemic." And I
Mhm.
thought, oh my gosh, this is perfect information to share during the symposium, because we really are, I hope, at the end of this pandemic. But they've been able to use data, and we haven't had a lot of data on the pandemic. So this is really some of the first information, right? But I
Right.
think it's very informative. I just want to mention a couple of the points here, and then perhaps each of you wouldn't mind just reacting, or perhaps sharing some information. So they point out that the pandemic's effect was differential across industries, right, and across job areas. And so the pandemic itself hit the retail sector, the hospitality sector, much harder than it hit the health sector and the digital sector, because we all are now online. So the Zooms of the world were booming, right? But they made a point that these differential impacts across industries and jobs actually were differentially hurting women, and not men. And a couple other points that I found in their report. They said that more women have lost jobs than men during the depths of the pandemic, and actually more than since they've started collecting the data in 1948. So that's a very substantial loss of jobs for women. More women left the workforce, making the labor force participation the lowest among women since 1985. Now that's a critically that's a very, very unfortunate thing to hear, because we need women to. The whole point about entry is get in there and get going, and this is a these kinds of stats, which are, and they also point out that Black and Hispanic women faced unemployment rates that were substantially higher than white women. So there was also a differential effect among women
Mhm.
between races. So the pandemic is having its impact for sure. But I think the question maybe that comes to mind when you read these stats is, what do we do and what can we do? And I know the answers are not at our fingertips, but perhaps we can speculate a little bit on how the pandemic has really affected women's business, and what we can do to help women's business to weather this storm. Who would like to comment on that? Sine, do you
Yeah,
want to, or Aji, please start.
I was going to just start by saying that we also, the Census Bureau also collected data from the annual business survey, which is by demographics. So part of the data that I showed. And in the 2020 reference year, they did ask some questions related to the pandemic and its impact on U.S. businesses, or mostly employer businesses. And so those numbers will probably be coming out later on this year. So we'll be able to have a better feel of how the pandemic affected businesses. So this would be sort of a supplement to what this DOL report showed. But one thing that was very striking to me from the report is the the decrease in the number of hours worked by women. And this is mostly attributed to childcare, because we went Zoom, everyone went Zoom, it's closed, the schools shut down. And so who was bearing most of the pain and watching the kids and making sure homeworks are done and that the kids woke up and were connected and ready to go? So that's not, it's striking, but it's kind of like, yeah, you would expect to see that. Also, I just wanted to make the connection between the occupations that were discussed in the report, like home health, these occupations that are more predominantly women based occupations, and how they were a lot of the jobs there were shaved as well. And so, and that could be, when we look at earlier, I showed the concentration of women-owned businesses in areas like healthcare and social assistance. And we have a large share of women-owned businesses. So you can only imagine the impact the pandemic had on that, and retail trade as well. So I just wanted to make those connections. I'm sure Tanae will have more information on sort of anecdotal information as to what happened to the businesses on the ground.
No, you really said it, and I love how you just connected the labor data with the business data, because it really is intertwined. Those who owned retail businesses, those who were solopreneurs and had a healthcare or a health aid business, the same numbers, you'll see the same sort of decline or impact again, and not unless those folks were able to take their business to e-commerce, and not everybody was able to do that. Those who were able to do that sometimes were able to strengthen their businesses. But yes, childcare was a contributing factor. And I think what we'll take from it, right, is a silver lining, is that now there is a hyper attention to childcare and paid family medical leave. Just yesterday, I was on a panel with the with a number of amazing women really talking about the childcare industry. So it's from both sides, right? It's from the consumer, which I am, in terms of I needed childcare, I needed support, or I need daycare. And also from the care economy itself. Daycares across the country had to shut down immediately and lost everything. And so now we're looking at the business model, the funding model, the supports that need to go around it. And if we can get this right, both on the care economy side and on how we support consumers, which is predominantly the mothers and families of that end, then we can make some strides in women's ability to stay in the workforce and women's ability to start and keep businesses. Now, some women left those jobs, as I mentioned before, out of necessity, whether their jobs ended, it was an in-person job or what have you, and or they needed to come home and take care of their children. And then there were those who then created their online businesses because they were able to do a little bit by also managing Johnny and Jane on Zoom school. But it was very difficult. And I will say in my own personal experience that it was also very hard to be committed to the 9 to 5 and to my child at the same time. And I think what, and I don't know if we're talk about sort of, again, the other impact of COVID, but now we've got workplace flexibility. Right now, we've got a culture that is standing up and noticing it. And now we are looking at it on a more holistic level, what we're going to do with childcare and what we're going to do with paid leave, because it isn't just taking care of your child, but also relatives. But it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take for everybody to tune into that. But I will say that women-owned businesses are going to get this right first. Meaning they walk in with that understanding that the culture and the flexibility needs to be in place for their workforce to give 110%. So we'll see.
That's a silver lining. It's a silver lining of the pandemic that I think eyes have been opened to some of these more flexible opportunities. I guess I'm sort of hearing you. I don't know if you agree with this. It might be interesting if you have a comment, but it seems like if we go to a more work at home situation going forward, and some companies are doing this 100%, not the majority, but some are. And certainly they're going to consider, like you said, Tanae, much more flexibility for their workers. I think that bodes well for women's entry and participation in business and in invention. Do you all agree? I think maybe you said that. Maybe I'm just paraphrasing what you already said, but
yes, I agree.
Okay, good. It seems like a silver lining.
Yes, I agree.
It's hard to know right now. We don't know yet, but it's certainly important. So the pandemic has it has had these potentially positive impacts along with a lot of negative impacts. But one thing that I wanted to point out that you brought up, Aji, is that the Census Bureau has this Small Business Pulse Survey, I think it's called. Um,
Right.
and
Mhm.
that's a pretty amazing thing. It's gone out weekly over several phases, I think, over the course of the pandemic. And they've asked small
Mhm.
companies different things about how the pandemic's affecting their economic circumstances. Do you know if that survey has some information about demographics, and will that information ever be okay? Does that survey does not ask about demographics?
We currently don't have information by demographics, just by industry. So I'm not sure if we will, but that's a good question. And I will ask the folks that are involved in that survey to see if if they'll potentially produce some estimates by demographics. But they have information on PPP loans, the rate of applications versus the rate of receiving the loans and the like. So, but that's a
Okay.
great question. So I'll
Okay.
defer.
Yeah. Well, I
Uh,
hope that if they don't have it, I hope they add it. It's
right.
it's a great product that you all are doing at the
It
Census
is.
Bureau, and I think it's important for people to kind of know about that. Um, well, we're getting into our last part of our seminar or our symposium today. And I think maybe it's worthwhile to start highlighting some resources and some paths forward. I think we've been touching on a little bit of that already. Don't get me wrong, but let's see if we can wrap up some of these things. And so I'll start off here just to kind of seed the ground, if you will, and I hope you all can pick up on some of these things or others. The So when I think about commercialization, I often think about, okay, we've got to be knowledgeable about the markets. We've got to somehow like prepare ourselves, like what's going on. So it's there's an educational component that goes beyond high school and college. It's an education about how do you actually be a business person? How do you enter a market? How do you market a product? There's a whole lot to learn there that I was never taught in school, and I'm just guessing others have not been taught that either. So there seems to be a real gap. So preparing is one of the key things. The second key thing that I think about with this commercialization and entrepreneurship is protecting, right? So I've prepared myself, I'm knowledgeable, I've got a new idea, perhaps it's patentable. How do I protect it? Well, you could patent it, or you could get a trademark on your company name, or there's a copyright, right? For copyrights, there are different types of intellectual property that can help you protect. Okay, so now I've prepared myself, I've now protected myself so that I can share with others, right? I can go and approach a venture capitalist. I can go and I can connect. So the third thing I really think about is connection. And that's where, the entrepreneur goes and gets in part of the SBIR program or hooks up with a venture capitalist or somehow gets engaged with one of the many programs that are offered by the federal government. And I'm not even mentioning several of them, which I hope you all can highlight a couple of them. So this important connect piece is also there. And so if we can prepare, protect, and connect, I think we can start to bring in more women into the business realm, and see the success that Aji has already shown us with the data. And so let me just add one more thing to this before I pass it over. I guess I'll pass it to you, Tanae, in a minute. Um, when we talk about resources, and I've been focused on patenting, right, and women's participation in patenting. So I just want to mention a couple of resources there in case anyone listening does not, or perhaps viewing does not know about them. So the first resource I would like to mention is called Patents View. It's a web-based data sharing and visualization platform at www.patentsview.org. It's all one word, Patentsview. On that platform, which is supported by the Office of the Chief Economist and the USPTO, there is a gender and innovation page where we actually put the data that we use in our progress and potential reports, where we talk about women's participation in patenting, all of that information is there. And we have some graphics that show the entry of women into the patenting over time, right, from 1976 through 2020. And there's some very interesting facts there, in addition to having the data that one can actually put together their own information and their own take on the numbers if they're interested. So I think that's one of the kind of data resources in the IP environment that could potentially help. So if you think about an entrepreneur who has an idea, is there a patent out there on that idea? There's a number of ways to search the patent world. The Patents View will allow you to search patents. We also have at the USPTO some search capabilities that are quite good. So between everything, I think entrepreneurs can find out about the environment that they're working in. So that's one of the key resources that I wanted to point people to on the patenting side. But that's only one piece. That's the protect piece. It's not the connect piece. And we need to do all of these things to get women into the business environment. So perhaps Tanay, you can let us know a little bit about that third piece, or whatever piece you'd like to talk about.
Sure. Thank you, Andy. Well, most entrepreneurs will say either I don't know where to start, or there's so much I don't know how to get started. So I'm going to share some information. I hope it's not overwhelming, but it also depends on where you are in your journey. I think I want to lift up first, just yesterday, the SBA announced a new partnership. It is called Building a Better America, and it's a small business resource community with virtual series that will connect small businesses with SBA, with the SBA and its network. So that's one place just to get started. If you go to the SBA website, you're gonna see everything. There are now various journeys and the Ascent program where you can learn from A to Z. If you're just getting started and you're in ideation phase, you can go there. But if you're also in the growth phase, there are a number of opportunities to connect to courses and information there. SBA also has women's business centers and small business development centers throughout the country. And many of our new women's business centers are partnering with MSIs and HBCUs, so minority serving institution and historically Black colleges and universities, which I think is amazing. This is the largest number of women's business centers that we've ever seen. And so you also can walk in, right? You've got the SBA online, but you can walk in and have a conversation and get some guidance. Then at SBA, we've got capital programs, we've got programs in innovation in the Office of Innovation and Investment, and so much more. But then there's our partners over at the Department of Commerce with Minority Business Development Administration. So you can go there and get support. There are SBIR and STTR programs scattered through a number of agencies. You've got the Women's Business Enterprise Council and Walker's Legacy, Native Women Lead, Black Girl Ventures, 1863 Ventures, the Fearless Fund. And then last thing I'll say is that the SBA is holding a Women's Summit scheduled for March 28th through March 30th. Please go online.
Oh, I think we've got a pause in our our connection. I didn't know whether it was me, but it looks like it's Tanay's connection. Okay. Well, Aji, what do you think about these resources that would be available? Would you like to add?
So I was going to add to Tanay's list. Actually, she's covered most of it, and I wanted to just mention, right, the Minority Business Development Agency, which has technical centers across the U.S. And there's a lot of access out there. There's a lot of information out there. I'll say, within the SBA, she's mentioned. I think it's just sort of being the lack of knowledge that sort of like most people have, because the general layperson or might not know where to start. But I would say that looking into SBA, looking into MBDA, technical centers would be great starts. Also, you'll have a variety of information on different industries, what industries are doing. You'll be able to do sort of market analysis in terms of sector. And I just say, leverage all the information that can be found out there, and don't think that, you don't have access, because access is there. It's just, do people actually go to it? Because when I look at the Small Business Pulse survey that you mentioned earlier, Andy, when we looked at the first phase of the PPP loans and, those who actually went and applied for it versus those that received the loans, we saw that if you applied, you were more likely to receive. But if you didn't apply, then, there was nothing that could be done there. So, just sort of piggybacking on that information is that if you go out there and you search for the information, because the information is out there, and you tap into it, you might actually get the help that you need to become a successful business owner, or start out, your business successfully. So I just say, leverage all the information, tap into your technical centers, and they'll be able to guide you.